Welcome to the Monocle Podcast. We are an independent management consulting firm, and in this podcast, we discuss our latest insights and opinions to help you achieve exceptional performance in banking and insurance together.
Welcome to the Monocle Insights Podcast. I'm Rogan, Pietersen, Associate Director at Monocle. Joining me today is Richard Hough, Head of Change and Control for Treasury and Capital Management at ICBC Standard Bank, or ICBCS. In this episode, we'll discuss Basel 3.1 and share key insights from the implementation journey that Monocle has undertaken with ICBCS to help the bank prepare for go live at the end of the year for UK banks. Richard, welcome and thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, Rogan. Very nice to be here.
So, as the head of change and control in the regulatory reporting space, the Basel programs at the bank have fallen pretty much under your remit. Having worked closely with you on the Basel 3.1 implementation, one thing that stood out was how early we established a clear and well-defined implementation structure. I suppose, how did your experience from previous regulatory programs kind of shape this approach? Were there any key lessons learned from the original Basel 3 implementation that you may have applied to the Basel 3.1 journey and came up with some of the structures that we put in place along the program?
Very involved in what we deem CRR2 project. We as a firm were still kind of had a label. In effect, that label carried on to our CRR3 project or UK Basel 3.1 program, but I was project managing the earlier iteration of the rule changes. And we learned a lot from that project. In setting up our UK Basel 3.1 project, we started with kind of lessons learned and what we wanted to consider up front and perhaps running through some of those key lessons. I think documentation was a significant learning and quality documentation that was kind of shared, reviewed and signed off. So I guess there you're thinking of business requirement documents, and that really kind of the importance there is that point around review and sign off. And I think it's only when you get the guys involved and formally signing off on this documentation that you get the kind of proper detailed review and challenge and kind of value from them. So review and sign off of BRDs was a key one. I think as well, and Rogan, you were very involved on our side here, what we deemed a traceability matrix was fundamental as well. And that is a article by article review of the new requirements, whether new rules actually impacted us. And if they did impact us, how? Is it new data requirements, new calculations? And then it kind of acted as our tracker to allow us to tick off the changes as we go through the project. So I think especially with the various iterations of the rules from the regulator, having that base traceability matrix was fundamental, and being able to kind of tick through those changes each time rules were shared was valuable. So I think that's a key piece to consider.
And I think proper documentation is so undervalued in these kind of programs. I think often we worry too much at the beginning around what the impacts and changes are for us, and we don't pay attention to really sitting down and documenting the intricate details of the changes. You mentioned the traceability matrix there. I think that formed quite a crucial project artifact for us. And if you look at the nature of how that document worked, it's really a live document that you maintain throughout the project. And it serves a number of purposes. First of all, it really provides evidence of the line-by-line analysis that you do on the regulations. And then what that does is it provides a platform for your policy teams to review these changes that are applicable to your organization in line with what the previous policies and the previous rules state. And you can make then real informed decisions around the nature of those changes and the impacts to your business. Moreover, as you mentioned there, it also provides a platform from tracking that throughout the project lifecycle. Once you understand the nature of the changes on a line item level, you can then look at the systems, for instance, that are impacted by these changes, and you can track the upgrades and model upgrades and IT changes through those. You can also identify changes in an operating model and procedure that you need to apply within the bank. And again, this is all cataloged and tracked through this document. And then finally, I suppose at the end of it, it really serves as an artifact for the regulators and for audits to review and take hold of. It essentially proves your compliance because it shows every change and every system update and every rule impact that is associated with your program. So I agree, couldn't be more important to get that documentation done, set up well from the beginning and maintained throughout the life of the project.
Yeah, look, fundamental document, absolutely. And this is regulatory change we work in, right? So this isn't sort of high level change with kind of freedom around the edges. This is making sure you are adhering to key specific regulatory requirements, and that catalogue, article by article, is key in that journey, I think.
Another thing that stood out for me in this process was the impact assessment operating models and frameworks that were really pushed from very early on. In my mind, this allowed us to get a very early and consistent view of the capital impacts. Although it was a very manual exercise in the early stages of the program, I think it was critical in acclimatizing the organization to the changes and building support for the program. Do you think this is something that you'll carry on into other programs? What was your experience on the making sure that those impact assessments were scheduled from the start?
Yeah, look, I think that was key. I think a learning we took again from our earlier CRR2 project was to test as early as possible, but test involving key stakeholders, so the likes of the reporting team, and try and carry out that testing kind of front to back. So you are learning kind of key handoffs, key touch points, operating model considerations. I think you can build components and you can test that and you can be happy with that, but you really need to join everything up to understand how it's all working and what gaps you might have. So we really tried to prioritize that upfront and early. And those impact assessments formed part of that, understanding your capital requirements under the new rules, but trying to flow that from front to back, as I said, running data through, trying to populate returns and get capital output and put that way, pretty useful, I think.
And I suppose the biggest value it also adds to the organization is education on a desk level, helping desks plan for the impacts to their RWA. Although I suppose it is sometimes dangerous to let desks know of expected reductions in RWA before having proper model system upgrades in place. They tend to get quite excited about that.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to be careful, and that there have been changes throughout, and the regulator has made changes, and timelines have moved and stuff. So that messaging to the front office on the impact of new rule changes has to be well positioned. And look, it's a big factor of this project and the UK Basel 3.1 go live is the fact the rules have been delayed, go live dates pushed and pushed. And that has been a challenge of this project that we've had to navigate. And, do you put the pause on the project at certain stages, or do you, try and keep momentum? But obviously that has a budgeting impact. So that's been quite an interesting variable, I guess, here as well.
Yeah, and you're exactly right, because no matter the learnings we've taken from previous programs, I think one of the biggest challenges we've had to navigate on this particular implementation are those delays, or several delays in regulatory timelines and uncertainty that that's brought about. First of all, when these delays occur, this naturally raises questions with senior management about whether the program should be paused, as you say, delayed, until further clarity is provided by regulators, or whether it's been more prudent to maintain momentum and push forward with the implementations. Ultimately, looking at how we tackled the delays at ICBCS, we ultimately chose to move forward. In hindsight, you believe that there was still the correct decision to be made, and there's obvious considerations here across, impending cost of delayed programs. Then on the other side, the skills and momentum loss that you might get from paused programs.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? So we started our project here, ICBC Standard Bank, in Feb 23. So at that stage, go live was 1st of Jan 25. You're like, we've got, just the best part of 2 years to try and get ready for these new changes. That seemed pretty reasonable, albeit you needed a reasonable chunk of resources to get you ready for that point. Then came the delay to the 1st of Jan 26 and more recently to the 1st of Jan 27. And you're right, how do you react? How do you tackle that? Now you're the best part of 4 years since we first started our project. And yeah, the response we've been able to take with sort of buy-in from senior management is go a little bit slower, but retain resources, retain the expertise, and keep the project going. And I think for me that's key. The moment you kind of downing tools and losing resources that have been involved in the project from day one, you're really putting yourself at risk. So yeah, we went a little bit slower, but retained kind of our key resources, and that's been important, I think. Obviously, a big factor as you start building stuff, you have code changes, you have kind of test environments up and ready, and protecting that kind of code base and builds for the best part of 4 years is tricky but crucial.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. We've seen programs stall and pause for 6 months, and I truly believe that a 6 month pause is actually more likely a year pause because of the pickup rate, the upskilling of new resources, and just getting the business and the programs back into the swing and the momentum that they were carrying before that pause. Ultimately, it does come down to cost versus, say, cost effort and the cost savings discussion. The risk here is that you proceed with this work, you proceed with this program, you continue your system upgrades. And I think one of the biggest concerns, I suppose, especially with Basel 3.1 in the UK, was whether it would in fact go ahead at all. And that raises quite a difficult question around whether a delay should indicate a pause to the program, or whether we should forge ahead. I think ultimately the decision to forge ahead was the right one, but it doesn't come as an easy decision.
No, agreed. Yeah, in hindsight, yeah, I think we made the right calls and we moved forward. And yeah, the challenge is always from senior stakeholders, project sponsors, is are you building stuff that you're going to throw away? Because again, we were building on the basis of draft rules, if you like, and those rules have only been formally finalised the start of this year. So that's always a tricky kind of variable to navigate as well. But fortunately, most of that early build has kind of been useful and stands. So that's been a good win.
Leading into the kind of next item here is, notwithstanding some of the easier system upgrades with minor risk weight changes on your credit risk, for example, there have been some major differences in the credit risk space. One of the biggest hurdles we've had to navigate is the changes in how unrated institutions are assessed for their risk weights. For those that don't know, Basel 3.1 has introduced an entirely new system for deriving risk weights for unrated institutions or banks, whereby these institutions must be graded against a set of qualitative data, i.e. your financial ratios to assess capital adequacy, but also against a set of qualitative requirements. And that's really to assess a view of solvency and almost repayment capacity of your counterparties. So this is something that we obviously could not have anticipated prior to Basel 3.1. And again, any structures and learnings you're taken from previous programs do not really relate to how we tackled this problem. There were two questions there, I suppose. One is a data question and how we source the key ratios and minimum regulatory requirements. The questions are on whether this is done in-house and manually or through vendor data packages. And I suppose that is something that is an inherently new question under these programs, and not only for us, but also for the vendors that supply this data. Maintaining the momentum on the project allowed us to, I would like to think, really answer these questions at a cellular level, figure out how the organization is best placed to tackle these problems, and explore the different types of data and data sources that may be available to us. Do you have any thoughts on the question of this qualitative data and how the assessment has brought you perhaps or required closer reliance on your credit risk teams as such?
Yeah, as you say, quite a big change here and opened us up to having to consider a number of questions here. But I think, as touched upon, we were relatively early in our journey when we were considering this rule change. So I had time to think about the options rather than forge ahead, panicking as such. So yeah, options out there, as you've touched upon. There's quantitative data requirements that ask you to source ratios for unrated institutions, capital ratios, liquidity ratios, leverage ratios, for example. Now, you think a good chunk of that data should be publicly available. Firms have to publish Pillar 3 documents, and a lot of that information is included in those documents. So I think our initial thinking was, well, yes, maybe a vendor can supply this, but this is largely information we think should be publicly available, and therefore, can we source this ourselves? So we have been on that journey. We have been able to source a good amount of this. We're even exploring kind of AI type options. Can we use AI to source this information and trawl the web for key Pillar 3 documents, key financial statement documents, and pick this up ourselves rather than paying a vendor to do it? That said, there are vendors out there, and we've been engaged with them who are offering their services to supply this data at a cost. And then does that make your life easier in terms of plumbing it through into your reg capital credit risk calculations and then automating the output in terms of applying these new risk weights? Yeah, maybe it's a little bit more streamlined. So yeah, I think where we've landed is considered materiality, and it's not a huge factor in terms of our population of unrated institutions. And so we are tending to veer down towards the more manual, but as I said, AI type route, but still maintaining conversations with vendors to see if we change that approach going forward.
Yeah, and it all comes down to how you define your approach and then the subsequent operating model. If you choose to, as you said, the data should be publicly provided and available. It should be then a case of accessing that and documenting the ratios against the requirements. Now, looking at the scope of your portfolio, that may be feasible and it may not be feasible. So you've got to make that decision early on as to whether you can expend the internal capacity to undertake these assessments. Alternatively, and this could be a good use case for the new AI programs that are running within organizations to extract the data and present it in a readable format and do that heavy lifting of not necessarily making the grading decisions themselves, but at least aggregating and compiling the data that information or these decisions can be based off. And then again, you've got the vendor approaches, which are obviously a more costly approach, but do all of the heavy lifting for you in that data acquisition component. I think one thing that has to be, I suppose, understood is that neither of those three options make the actual decision for you. So vendors and AI are never going to provide the actual gradings, but they're going to provide the underlying data, key ratios against their minimum requirements for you to do that assessment. And there's still that model build, if you want to call it that, to actually undertake and do that assessment. Have you taken that modeling component to task within your own space, or have you involved any additional, banking areas, the likes of credit risk teams, to be involved in that grading assessment?
Yeah, good question. I mean, yeah, I think you alluded to it at the start, right? There's quantitative data requirements for this unrated institution new calculation approach, but there's also qualitative pieces, and that is the piece where, as you touched upon, you do need to consider whether a counterparty has the adequate capacity to meet financial commitments on an ongoing basis. Are they subject to substantial credit risk? Is there an adverse audit opinion out there? So they're key factors that, I don't think you can automate. You need expertise overlay, and that's where our links with the credit risk function have come in, and we do require their input. So I think that comes back to one of our earlier points we noted here around trying to do sort of front to back full testing here, and that includes the operating models and handoffs that are going to exist in this process here, for example. So yes, source your quantitative data, whether that's vendor or manual or AI or other, but you need to overlay that qualitative component, and that has to be, I think, discussions and working closely with a credit risk function who are obviously the experts to answer those style of questions. And so knitting that all together to then plumb somehow through into your calculation system to get the right answer has its intricacies and is worth exploring as early as possible.
Yeah, exactly. And I asked that question because it's also a bit of a common theme that I've seen through the new regulations, and that is the almost greater reliance that the regulations seem to place on the credit risk teams, both with regards to that aspect, but also in some of the due diligence requirements we've seen. It seems that the external ratings that are used for corporates and institutions do require an assessment now to be, I suppose, assessed against the internal views of those same ratings. So what that means is that organizations, I suppose, are being forced to compare their external ratings to what their internal ratings would be, and they effectively mark down the external rating if it is out of line with the internal rating views of the bank. And while we're still using external ratings, they are being very closely aligned to the credit risk's internal views of counterparties and to how IRB models typically are assessed, which is quite interesting.
That is another important change, and you're right. I do think some of these rules really are pushing us to work closer with the credit risk functions, and this is another key one that has the potential to have a really quite material impact. When do your internal ratings differ quite substantially to the external ratings, then you do take quite an RWA hit because of the new rule changes in place. So that close working relationship with credit risk and understanding why there are differences, why external ratings are better rated than perhaps some of our internal ratings is important.
Yeah, it's almost kind of changing the mindset a bit and bringing those two functions closer together, getting clarity on what those differences may mean. And that could obviously spell out a very valuable reassessment of what the external ratings are and bring risk assessments more in line to one another. But I think traditionally, especially the standardized approaches, it has just been a external rating based view, and the internal ratings or credit risk internal views of these exposures have typically not crossed over into your regulatory reporting world. And now we're seeing they are. And probably, I suppose, sticking to the topic of data sourcing and ratings, one of the other intricacies we've seen is the introduction of external ratings that are exclusive of government support, or XGS ratings as they've termed them, and that's to be applied for rated institutions, banks. This presents a rather unique data sourcing challenge in that rating agencies were not historically offering these ratings. Or how have you found the pressures of acquiring this data in relation to the program timelines? And is this something that you're still working towards, or that you found you've been able to integrate fairly early on?
Yeah, this one's been a tricky one, and we have been engaging external credit rating agencies that we work with as early as possible on this, but kind of with differing levels of feedback and in terms of the changes they're making on their side to reflect, credit ratings without government support. So a key agency that we utilise has been on the ball here relatively early doors, and we've been able to work closely with them and get a feed of ratings data excluding government support that we then will apply for institutions. But other rating agencies do not seem to be sort of nearly up the curve in that respect. And so we're at this kind of point where, with 7 or so months before go live, then we have XGS ratings for only a number of our rating agencies. So really then it's trying to understand what does that mean? Does that mean for other agencies we have to treat institutions as unrated, which would naturally have really quite a material capital impact? Or I think we're a bit uncertain here, and perhaps looking for guidance, and perhaps there'll be something from the regulator to kind of confirm the approach nearer to go live. But it does seem strange that an industry hasn't more sort of commonly spawned up to react to these rule changes, and only a handful of the rating agencies are reacting to implement XGS ratings, and others do not seem to have. So that's been our struggle. We've done what we can with the ratings agencies that have been on top of this change, but that others aren't, and we're kind of trying to understand the approach forward, I think.
Yeah, and it raises an obvious policy decision within the organization, right? We have to move forward, and we have to make a call with the little guidance that has been provided by regulators on how we move forward with not just the impact assessments, but really ramping up into your parallel runs and into go live. Jumping back to the impact assessments, this raised questions back then, right? Is how do you understand the impacts to your RWA when XGS ratings weren't provided? So we're having to make policy type decision calls on how we manipulate the ratings to best reflect the XGS ratings. Then, as we've been provided a little bit more clarity from ratings agencies around what these impacts might look like, we would be better being able to, I suppose, actually do the impact assessments and take these changes into account. But question still outstanding, as you've pointed out, is how do we now formalize our go live, and what kind of guidance are we going to get from the regulators? And is this going to be left up to internal policy decisions? An obvious one that you touched upon was, if we're using ratings from various agencies, but only one of those agencies are providing XGS ratings, does that mean that any rating that is not provided by that sole ratings agency should now fall into an unrated box? And we've seen what happens, the impacts that have come about with the changes to unrated institutions. Or are we able to just use XGS ratings for those individual exposures and apply those across?
Yeah, it's a crucial call, right? With a really quite material RWA impact. So I guess we are seeking clarity as soon as possible. But Rogan, you were involved in the project within our firm of trying to onboard that XGS data for one of the rating agencies we use, and it's not a short journey, right? There's obviously the contractuals around that process, but it's plumbing in that data and using it within your calculation engines, and making sure that testing is complete and all working as expected. So with a handful of months, to go before go live is a bit of a tricky situation to be in that has a very material impact. So yeah, guidance would definitely be welcome here.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you mentioned, as you say, what, 7 months or so left to go live. Now, what we should be looking at is where we are, and really starting the formalization of our processes as we look to that go live date. Jumping back to, I suppose, where you are in your journey, properly planned and executed parallel runs, I suppose, are both quite close to both of our hearts. Implementations rarely go to exact plan, and not leaving your parallel runs too late gives you the better opportunity to get it right on go live. What in your mind are the kind of critical components to a well organized or well planned parallel run? And what are the other benefits that make you such a strong proponent to having these planned well in advance with sufficient time, I think, is the crucial part left until go live.
Yeah, it's key. I think there's a number of factors. I think communication is vital. So I think you're having to plan those parallel runs as early as possible, make sure that key stakeholders, those involved in the parallel runs, are aware of the timings and their expected involvement. So everyone understands their role. That comes with a bit of education. So for this project, it's making sure our reporting teams are aware of all the changes. These are teams that lead the current co-rep reporting, for example, but they need to understand what is changing and what they should be looking out for. But yeah, so it's lining that up as early as possible. But then during the parallel run itself, it is a parallel run. It should be looking to mirror what happens in production. So that is, lining up environments so that the data is feeding as would be expected in production into calculation engines, into returns. The analysis and the kind of control related reporting is being considered through into the submission format preparation, so XBRL generation. And so, following that full journey and, mirroring production is where you understand your gaps. And if you've tested everything on a kind of standalone basis, you've looked at numbers into returns and you've tested the XBRL piece separately, there's usually, running it front to back and kind of repeating myself there is where you tend to find the issues, the gremlins, the stuff that needs your attention. And so trying to give yourself as much time in advance of go live to address that is crucial. So we certainly have considered a parallel run and ran one early last year and looking to run a couple more this year with time to react. But each time, in theory, it gets smoother, kind of shinier end product and happier people all round. So that's the plan on our side. But yeah, absolutely crucial to get these runs in early.
Yeah, I think two things stand out for me there is one, we've been around the block long enough to understand that executing a run book that requires parallel environments, parallel jurisdictional setups within reporting engines, submission mechanisms in parallel. There's a lot of moving parts, and the regulatory reports have a lot of inputs from across the bank, and getting the data lined up and structured and ready for a proper parallel run is a massive task in itself. There will always be challenges and there will always be issues in getting this data well lined up and ready for the parallel run, and getting an early view on how your data is set up and ready for this as early as possible, I think is absolutely crucial, because you do not want to be left dealing with mismatched environments and system change blocks and such in the latter parts of this year. And it's something that you probably, for your first parallel run, spend most of your time on. And you want to leave yourself with enough time in your subsequent parallel runs that this is no longer an issue and you can actually execute your parallel run book as desired. And then I suppose another big thing for me is, and you mentioned it, on the communication and getting the teams set up properly. I think what we often forget is that the regulatory reporting teams are under immense BAU regulatory reporting pressure come month end, quarter end, and we do not want to make the parallel run a sideshow for them, right? They need to be able to pay proper focus and proper attention to these results. And doing this and planning this early in the year and giving them a number of parallel runs in which to complete, although it may add to the number of reviews they need to do, at least gives them the opportunity to spend more critical time in viewing this data and not let it be a rushed, stressed role that they come quarter end reporting, and especially at the end of the year as they ramp up into year end reporting.
Yeah, absolutely. Finding that sweet spot where, the reporting team can dedicate as much time as they can to reviewing these changes is key. I think with the regulatory delays, I don't think they've necessarily helped us in this regard. As I said, we certainly on our side carried out parallel runs last year, but as long as that deadline moves and the go live's another year and a half away, it's hard for reporting teams, as you say, who've got BAU responsibilities, to dedicate as much time, and they're dealing with other priorities. So that has been a slightly tricky obstacle, but obviously now with go live dates firmed up, it's crucial that as soon as possible this year you get those parallel runs in and everyone working as hard and spending as much time as possible to make sure we're good. But you also raise the right point around IT involvement and environment setup and all the sort of related infrastructure and architecture there. That's a huge undertaking that only improves with the multiple iterations of these parallel runs and making sure that everything by the end hopefully runs through as seamlessly as possible, as kind of straight through processing maxing out on as much of that as possible, then yeah, these parallel runs help achieve that, I think.
Yeah, completely agree. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today and the practical insights you've been able to share.
Thank you very much.
For our listeners that would like to know more about what we do at Monocle and how we can assist you in reaching your Basel 3.1 milestone in the UK, or in understanding the impacts of the US Basel Endgame's newly proposed rules, you can view our website, where you can find our contact information. We will also be publishing a comparative insights paper between the US Basel Endgame and the UK and EU rule sets, which you'll find under our insights section. Thank you for listening, and good luck ahead as we ramp up to go live.
Visit monoclesolutions.com to subscribe for updates. From Johannesburg to London, Cape Town to Amsterdam, Monocle. We manifest change.